what are the recordings?
Thank you.
So I want to start today by just making one point, and then I'll open it up to you. I look at one phrase in the Constitution. It's that thing about all men are created equal. And that's in some ways the goal of our country. And just the saying itself is short of what we really want to do. Right? The gendered noun in there makes it so that it's short of what it needs to be. But I think what all of this book is saying is how do we expand beyond that? Because even when it was there, it didn't even really mean all men. It definitely didn't mean black men, but it also didn't mean non-property owning men. Right? And so through our history, we have continually tried to expand what that means and expand it beyond even just that word. So that women were given the vote. Or I should say women took the vote. That happened. And I guess that's what this whole book is about, is how do we look and say, not what it is that were the words of the founders or even the intent of the founders, but how have we expanded beyond that and what should we do in this moment? She is doing a really good job, I think, in this section of making us look at American history through a larger lens than what we have before.
Well, and she won the Pulitzer, and they don't give that out willy-nilly.
They do not. So she has some cred, and I think she's worth listening to, and to try to figure out how we make sure that we listen. Now, listening doesn't mean you have to agree to everything that she says, or even every way that she understands it, but be in the conversation. And I think that's the most important thing. She wants a conversation, and she is putting some really important things on the table to make us converse, to try to grow us beyond just all men to whatever the dream is. And it may not be even, I think our founding fathers, and I say it that way because there weren't very many mothers involved in the process. It was a male-dominated process. I think they had some ideas of how things worked. They had some ideas about what things should happen. But we all, when we set up things, it's hard for us to set them up without being prejudicial to our own selves. To what we need, what we want, where we get some kind of return on our investment. And all that, as we go through history, has to be continually struggled with and changed as situations change, as our concept of how life works changes. As we choose to expand ourselves, we need to expand our history. And so that's what this is happening. So I said all that. In this chapter, what struck you?
I think one of the first things was, and I forgot his name, the Royal Governor of Virginia.
Yes.
So we always learned about Bunker Hill and the Tea Party, but we didn't learn the obverse that part of the revolutionary fervor was when the Royal Governor of Virginia basically set this enslaved people to fight with the British. That created the fervor for Virginians to join the revolution. That's something that just was never mentioned in history.
Yeah,
and it helps bring out that picture.
Well, there are a lot of things that we are not told in history books, in our history books.
Right. And I believe sometimes it's because teachers learn from the same type of books we did, and so they learned a certain set of history, so they teach what's there. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't start teaching. His name is Dunmore, by the way, I just looked it up.
Mhm.
And we should learn about this proclamation that treated things very different. We should hear about the fact that the slaves on the American plantations, or the soon-to-be American plantations, chose to fight for the British in larger numbers than for the Americans. Why? Because they believed in freedom, and they didn't see the American solution being one of freedom. And frankly, the history proved them right.
Well, he offered them their freedom if they would come and fight for the British. And that was before Lincoln said anything about freeing them. And it said there were many, many, many more fighting for the British than there were for the Americans.
That's right. That's right. Hi, Joyce, how are you? Welcome.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Joyce.
Not getting started out very fast, but
All right.
I'm here.
What else struck you about this section? This
The use of forced labor camp to describe plantation.
Did
So
you just love that she chose to do that?
yes, and it just turns the entire, because the connotation of a plantation is very genteel, cultured way of life, and that's only from one point of view.
Yeah, let's give it another name. What did the workers on that plantation feel it was? No, not a plantation, as a general rule, right?
Yeah, not a plantation.
And so at least part of what she's trying to do is to get us to see things through the eyes of those folks who were living in that situation, not the cultured ones. I think it was last chapter said something like the victors have no, or the strong ones have no lack of people who want to tell their story. But who tells the story of the enslaved one? And I think that's what she's trying to do, is tell a different story from a different perspective. And to call that forced labor camps, that was pretty powerful.
Well, and basically that's what they were. And one of the reasons that Jefferson, who had a lot of slaves at the time he wrote the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, they often they saw the slaves not as human, but as commodities. And so it never crossed his mind that he should include them.
Right.
But it also said that although he had many children by Sally Hemings, she and his kids remained slaves, that they found that the slaveholders found it convenient to keep their children, who were half black because of various means, either willing or mostly rape, to keep them as slaves.
What's interesting about Sally Hemings is that she actually accompanied him to Thomas Jefferson to France, and so was in a space where she could have chosen freedom. I think they deal. We're not completely sure what all happened, but she chose to go back with him. I don't know if she got some kind of value. That the supposition is something along the lines of, you have to free my children after after we die, or something. But we don't know.
And if I read it right, I think Sally Hemings was half sister to Jefferson's wife.
There is a lot of different connections that we don't quite try to.
That we never read about in school.
Yeah. Well, we never even read about her when it comes down to it. Even though she's one of the better known stories of master-slave relationships. Because she had her own room in the house. and had a favorable position within the home of Thomas Jefferson. So anyway, I think the more important thing that she is really doing here, though, is she's trying to set those that were enslaved in a very different light than what typically gets set, what typically it says about them. I love this line. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy.
Yes.
And by that she meant is that effort of moving from all men to expanding what that really meant and truly including the men who were excluded as well as others. That is what the Black experience moving through America had been. When as soon as Civil War was won, freedom was granted, right? One of the first things that happened was the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, which freed the slaves, in reality did much more than that. Every single other group of,
Yes.
in whatever way, whatever group was not accepted as part of the voting populace, not the accepted voting populace, every other group has used that language to say we get to be too.
Yeah, yes, and I just want to step in. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves, and the 14th Amendment was the most powerful because it extended all the rights in the Bill of Rights to everyone. And remember, the Bill of Rights says Congress can't prevent, but using the 14th Amendment, that means the state can't prevent it either. And that was a big step.
Yeah.
And that's what pushed the major rulings back when we had the Earl Warren Court in the 50s and 60s.
Yes, and it moved us into whole different ways of being able to react to things. And it changed America. The hard part is that change, one of the big things that she's showing is she showed the history really well up until Reconstruction, and then Reconstruction came along and we tried it and then we failed at it. Right? And so by the time that who was it, Rutherford B. Hayes, one of the presidents, decided I'm not going to fight the fight. I'm going to take all the troops out of the Union troops out of the South, and you guys can just do what you want to. And so he essentially, for the political power, gave up the fight. And so then until the 1960s, so for over 50 years, we had the second slavery. And what's bad about that is at least the first slavery was an open, who were the masters, who were the slaves. The second slavery is more hidden. And I think that's really important that she points that out, that here by laws and whatnot, people were just put in their place, even though even because of those amendments, they had the rights that everyone else had. All those laws took the ability to exercise those rights away from them. And that's just horrible. I think I told you last week about a movie that I watched. Did I tell you about that, about Lowndes County?
About what?
Did I tell you about the movie called Lowndes County?
No,
I don't
All right,
remember.
so Selma, the people walked from Selma to Birmingham. Here's Selma, here's Birmingham, and most of this in between is Lowndes County. Okay, so that's where they walked through on that march. Lowndes County at the time of that march had exactly 0 Black residents that were registered to vote. 0. even though the county was more than 50% black. So they had the right to vote, they had the right of citizenship, but something was going on in that county, for example, that made it so that they didn't get to exercise that right. That's one of the places that the Black Panther movement kind of began, and some of the leaders of what became the Black Panthers were leaders in changing that, and within a short time of that walk, they registered enough people that they got Black people elected as sheriff, and I think, oh, there was one other position. I'm sorry, I can't remember what it was. That's what was important about the 60s, is it suddenly changed the story, right? And we entered into a new era where we were forcing things to happen that had been for most of the 1900s, if not all of the 1900s, had been shut off. Yep, you have the right to vote, but you don't get to.
Well, part of the problem was the 13th Amendment. Did you ever see the movie called The 13th?
I did.
Yes.
And because in there, as a placating the South, they put in there that everybody was free. You couldn't have forced labor unless they had been convicted of a crime. And so the goal in the South became convict as many Black men as we can of crime so that we can have this free labor.
Yeah.
And that's one of many things that has been used through the ages to assert control of white over other.
And I was glad that she used the word caste, because that's basically what developed. And the unfortunate thing is that the slave codes, which you mentioned, went away, but then the black codes came in afterwards,
Yeah,
which set up that caste. And it was all done legally.
yeah.
Well, there's another, I believe Pulitzer Prize winner called caste. And that's specifically what she's talking about, that we think we don't have a caste system in the US, but we most definitely do.
The name of that author is Isabel Wilkerson. And
Yeah.
if you get a chance, it's a relatively short book, but it's worth reading. Because it challenges us to say, why do you accept this caste? And much of the acceptance is because it's easier for us. It's advantageous for us. Why did all the South go back to that? Well, like Wendy said, if we have prison labor, it's free, or at least cheaper. And so we make more profit. The problem is that it doesn't answer the question at whose expense. And at least part of what she's asking throughout that is that question. That blacks in America have paid the price for much of the advancement that we've done without much remuneration.
And the hardest thing is that it became, Lyndon Johnson said it best, that I can pick the pockets of any white man by telling him he's the lowest is better than the best of, and he used we say black, but he used something a little bit less PC right now.
Yeah.
But it's true. It helped because the powers that be didn't want the poor black and the poor white to see what they had in common. And so this caste system developed, and that's one of the shames, I think, and it's still when Johnson signed the 65 Civil Rights Act, Bill Moyers, who was his press agent, or he told Bill Moyers, we've lost the South for a generation. And he was wrong. He's lost it for 2 or 3 generations.
2 or 3 generations.
Yes.
Maybe it's beginning to heal now. There's seems to be something that's beginning to heal that and bring it back, but he's right. The hard part is that I can't remember how exactly she said it, but that the Civil War didn't free Black slaves, it freed poor white. And by that, I think what she means is later on she talks something about how the white gentry needed white underlings to do the dirty work.
Mhm.
They could keep their hands clean, and the poor white did the ugly stuff. And that's definitely pretty true about much of the story post Civil War, isn't it? And so it's interesting to me how much somebody who might be close to as poor can feel better just because, well, my skin is white, but yours isn't. And we can have something to look down on. But is that helpful in the bigger picture? I found it interesting that much of that Reconstruction work, the poor Reconstruction work, I mean, the moving it back into a new era, the second slavery, was based on essentially that Blacks are an inferior race. And why I find that so interesting is because, okay, so you're the inheritors of slavery, you're a slave yourself, that makes you a slave race, but aren't we the inheritors of Moses and the other children of Israel who were slaves in Egypt? And our story is that we're not a slave race. It doesn't carry on, it's not inheritable, and yet that's the story we told ourselves about Blacks, as it is. How do we tell the one as a good Christian nation about ourselves, but don't tell it about them?
Well, and many who call themselves Christian these days act like anything but.
But the problem is that she mentions religion and literature came, or rather science and literature came in. Science gave evidence to show this was an inferior race, but also religion, which she left out, was this was the mark of Ham. So it was justified as biblical because those people with the darker skin were that was the mark of Ham, and therefore this is justified and it's in the Bible.
I'm glad you.
And all the references to slavery in the Bible there's plenty of proof text in there,
Yeah.
and you just skip over Exodus.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ron. Because some people don't know that terminology about that, the mark of Ham, but I grew up with it. You know, the Mormon Church, up until I was about to graduate from high school,
That's right.
good black faithful members of the church to have all the privileges of the church. They were denied what was called the priesthood, which every kid received it. Well, if you're not Black, up until the time that I was about to graduate high school. And that's the type of thing that carried on from our stories about Blacks through the ages, is we told stories that made it so some people were just left out, and we just accepted it. You know, I didn't have to worry about it because I didn't have any Black people in the church, so it didn't affect any of my friends, and yet I knew there was something wrong about that, inherently wrong. And because that's one of the things that began opening my eyes about what else can be true, what else should be true in this situation. I believe that's what she's trying to teach us, is how to look at it opposite. So when Civil War was terminated, everyone's free. The fear was blacks will now take out their revenge.
Yes.
And we've seen movies like that. I mean, if you saw Hotel Rwanda, terrible movie about Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, and how when, I can't remember which was which, but when one went out of power and the other came into power, they just began slaughtering the other tribe. And we there was just that assumption that would happen, and I think it's important that we realize that her take on it is not just her take, it is what happened. Blacks did not suddenly try to make recriminations about, but they tried to build us into the very best possible. The passing of the Naturalization Act, I thought, was an amazing thing, right? That said, as soon as it's now we have this freedom, let's make sure that no one else is put under a slavery type of thing. I think that's just remarkable things about Black America that we don't teach very often. Because they
Well,
could.
there is so much that we do not teach about our own history in this country.
Yeah.
For instance, doing genealogy, and some of the old books, the history books in those days were written by the local doctor and things like that. And if your family subscribed to helping print it, there was more about your family in the book. But that's where I learned that after the Revolutionary War, Pennsylvania and Virginia went to war, and they had troops, and they have lists of who died. And what was northwestern Virginia is now southwestern Pennsylvania. And there are lists, and also Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania on that end. They had armies, they fought each other. I never read that when I was a kid in school, but I found it in a couple of different books, and you look it up and there are lists of who died on each side.
That's because we wanted to be, we wanted to tell the story of the United States.
Exactly. But they all were going to war over land.
Yeah. Who owns what?
And there are so many, many, many things we are never taught about our own country. And to contrast, you have Germany, who makes sure that everybody in Germany studies and knows about the Holocaust so that they will not repeat it.
Yeah.
But here we ignore those things that aren't so pristine in our own past. And if you try to teach it now, they're banning the books. They're doing horrible things. And this DeSantis is one of the worst.
Well, and not just that, but also in the early part of the 20th century, when we started erecting Civil War Confederate state statues, right?
Mm-hmm.
To glorify those who took us in the wrong direction in order to teach it the wrong history.
Have you ever seen Stone Mountain, Georgia?
I have. In Atlanta? Is it Atlanta? Yeah.
Well, Stone Mountain is just outside of Atlanta, a little bit to the east. Because I was working there one summer. And originally the guy who did that, who also did the presidents up in South Dakota, they wanted him to put the entire Confederate Army on that rock.
Right.
They wanted the whole army there, and that's one statue you can't pull down.
Yeah.
So let me bring this up as a teacher, because there is age appropriateness.
Mm-hmm.
so first of all, I mean, but it's still missing it at junior high, high school, and college. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is American exceptionalism. So I can still honor Abraham Lincoln, knowing that his position evolved over time, and that he was always trading politics off, the world as it can be versus the world as it is. And we need to give that to all politicians of all people of the time, that they did what they could with the understanding that they had. And I mean, even George Wallace, I mean, what George Wallace started out, by the way, as someone who was quite polite to African Americans when he ran for office and lost. He said, "I won't be out N-word," and from then on he became George Wallace, and used what Ian Haney Lopez called strategic racism. He used it purposely to win votes, and that's been running, unfortunately, for the past 50 years.
Yeah.
But when Wallace couldn't use that anymore, he switched, and so part of it is just giving up exceptionalism, and then also being able to, and I don't know how we stop the second. That's a tough one.
The hard part, Ron, is that we canonize, and we say that everything in here is exactly truth. Nothing has truth. I look at the Constitution anymore, and I think, do I believe that God was involved somehow in that writing of the Constitution? Absolutely. I do not believe he wrote the 3/5 clause. Right? I just don't think the God that I believe in would ever have something like that in there. And so I think it's an inspired document. It doesn't mean it's a perfect document. And that the problem is that that's kind of what we want to do. And so we take and we say George Washington had to be perfect, and we don't admit to the problems that he had. And what she's doing with those founding fathers, with Lincoln, is she's saying they were not perfect. They were just who we had at the time, who made these decisions. Good or bad, right or wrong. And they didn't do everything that they could have, or everything that we think they could have, at least. And so we have to judge them not by today's standard. We have to judge them by that time's standards, and then say, so that's the decision they made for their time. How does it apply to today? How much of those do we hold on to, and what do we slip behind us?
Well, the thing is that as human beings, we are not perfect.
But we turn our heroes into perfect is the problem, Wendy.
Yeah, but they're not perfect either.
Right. But part of what we have to deal with is whoever is saying that they were, however they're saying that they were. Because some of the Supreme Court, for example, wants to go back and say only what they intended with the different things.
Yeah.
I think is completely against how they set up the Constitution. In my mind, this is what they did with the Constitution. They put in the things that they put in for whatever reason why they thought they needed to put it in. But much of it was to protect slavery, because many of the founders many of the writers were absolutely slave owning people, and they needed to protect their industry and their profit. But they also put in the ability to amend it and change it, and they started off the whole thing with putting on the 10 amendments to say that this that was is not the end of this. we're gonna start it off by giving you 10 things to change it. Which I think was a remarkable example of what I think they expected out of us. And so when we go back to, like Alito tried to do and say only what they thought, I just don't think that's has any place in America today.
Well, and Alito went way back to a judge in England who felt that burning a witch was okay.
Yeah, yeah,
When he talked about overthrowing Roe.
yeah.
And how on earth can you take that seriously?
Yeah,
But they did, and they overthrew Roe v. Wade.
but here's part of what you have to think about, because sometimes we complain about things like overthrowing of Roe v. Wade, but here's part of what Republicans have done over the last 20 years is they've become active in ways that Republicans didn't used to be. They did more of a grassroots type of movement than what the Democrats were more known for over the last 20 years, and they have gained a lot of political power, and they overthrew the Supreme Court because of some of that they did that we're not doing. And if we care about things like the Supreme Court, we have to start being active in politics in a different way than what we have been.
Well, if you read a little bitty book called Don't Think of an Elephant, he outlines in there what it is that the Republicans do to get everything they do, and the other side is not that well organized. But his book was supposed to come out on 9/11. Well, obviously it didn't, but he wrote an extra chapter in there after 9/11. But the Republicans have been organizing, and they've been currying the young people to become, their right wingers in a very organized manner since well before 9/11.
Sure.
And the Democrats, we'll get the blacks to vote for us, or we'll do this or that, but they are not organized. And it wasn't until Stacey Abrams really organized them in Georgia that they could see some of those results. But I think a lot of the states, I still hear in some states, well, we heard nothing from the Democratic Party. Nobody came here to talk to us. Well, you don't get votes that way.
I mean, let's look at just our own state legislature. Do you know the history of Arizona State Legislature?
Not totally.
Okay, so, all right. My great grandfather, Pop Pacer, served in the legislature in, I think it was 38, 39, right in that time frame. There was not a single Republican.
Yeah.
At that point, not a single one. That changed about in the 60s. Goldwater years, right in there is when it began to shift. And we assume today, to our own sorrow, that Republicans just control our House and Senate, and we should not do that.
But it has changed, and I want to bring up just organizing, both as a plug for Pima County Interfaith, but also what we can do at the local level beyond the partisan to reach across faith lines, even political lines, and work towards a common good, like education,
Yeah.
and others. And then I'm going to play the teacher and say, Joyce, how are you doing? Okay.
You're muted, Joyce. There
I'm
we go.
sorry, not doing a whole lot of running, a lot of talking though.
Okay. But it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Yes, it is. I
Good
haven't
to be
seen
here.
Joyce for long time.
And Ron, I'm glad you brought up education, because that's a huge thing. it appalls me that that's one of the battlegrounds where we fight with each other. We should all be for education. That shouldn't be one of our battlegrounds, and yet it often becomes one, doesn't it?
Yes. And and again, my, I worked in was a librarian for 18 and a half years at Amphi Middle School, where I went to school, and the population radically changed when I taught there. But it was good to bring out the voices in characters, to bring in books that had characters that matched our students. And I think that hurts our students when Nick Stone, who wrote, I think, Dear Martin and some others, the one on immigrant, that's one of the books that have been targeted. And of course, all the LGBTQ voices.
Yeah.
And as I've said, reading a book about someone who's doesn't turn you gay or trans, but it does open you up to the perspective. And I think in the long run, when we can see the humanity in the other, the power of the caste system or the othering used strategic racism breaks its power.
But I think that's why she does a good job pointing out in the Reconstruction era, one of the things that passed was free public, that was public schools, right? And which I think was, I believe, one of our country's most important investments. And I'm amazed how quickly in the post Reconstruction that it began to change again. Right? Let's maybe we have public education, but they're going to get poor schools. Right? They're going to get not the equipment they need. And so the use of education as a weapon against a group has been pretty typical.
Yeah.
Well,
and
and
then-
even in those cities which we consider quite progressive, like San Francisco, you still have that situation. For instance, when I was going to schools and talking to kids about stamp collecting, all those schools that had a lot of Asian kids had this was way back, a film strip projector and a cassette player in every room. I went to this one school and it had one broken down film strip projector and one not so hot recorder for the entire school. And you can guess what the difference was.
Yeah. Horrible, huh?
And the poorest teachers were at that school. The lack of books was at that school. And I was flabbergasted because I thought San Francisco was more progressive than that. We didn't use the word progressive then, but I thought it was less racist.
Last 9 years of my teaching career, I taught on the south side of Glendale. The south side of Glendale, other side of the tracks from downtown. It's more the Hispanic side of Glendale. And for the first 3 years of the 9 years I taught there, I was still in a cooler school rather than in an air-conditioned school. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. There's a reason why they were that part of the district was the last to get air conditioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can figure that out pretty easily.
Yeah.
And
well, and then also there's a battle in education. It's the same thing that we have on the with our politics is do we turn schools into places where we cut off the native, we take Native Americans, put them in boarding schools, cut off their hair and make them be all one, or do we acknowledge the founding principles and our ideals and then open it up to more diverse? And that's a challenge that runs throughout our history. And I'll bring up what I didn't bring up last week was I was in I scheduled or I booked a motel thing. It was a Knights Inn, KNIGHT, but it was NIGHT, and it was just basically a converted apartment complex in Oakland, not far from Berkeley. And I was the only white person in that entire area. And wherever I went, I was the only white person. And it brought up both a bit of fear until I told myself, this, you're right. This is a safe neighborhood. It's next to Berkeley. But I also then later said, I know what it feels like for somebody to be the only African-American or only Hispanic in a white neighborhood. And if we can, the de facto segregation hurts because then it also creates the inequality in schools, and we can't see the other if our kids, you know, if we don't have it reflected in our classrooms.
But
And that's a deep problem. Segregation's been a deep problem.
that means we have to purposely choose, evaluate, and think about, and then make choices around the things that we do. And Wendy, if you're right at all, that Republicans were active and Democrats chose not to be, then that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it is part of the problem.
We have to step into it. If we think that racial issues are important, then we have to step into those spaces. We have to start changing, not just accepting the status quo of who has control of, but stepping into those things. And so we have to say things like, why haven't we run for office? Why haven't, you know, what happened? Why aren't I involved in different areas of politics? Why aren't I sending a lot of money to certain people that are involved, that are doing the right things? You know, all of those kinds of questions. Because being active in politics is difficult. It's a challenge. Because there's when they say political battleground, it's not just metaphor.
Yeah, well, there was one Democrat, I forget what state, but it was back east. And he really had a real good chance of winning, but he said he was getting no money at all from the National Democratic Party. And he lost. But had they given him the money to help him and sent people out to help talk to the people in that state, we would have another congressman.
Yeah. The good news is that is changing, Wendy, in that in this last round of elections, Democrats outraised and outspent.
But this was this last round of elections, and this man who had a really good chance never got any support.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not sure, you know, which race you're talking about, or I can't speak to that. What I'm saying is that we can change it, but we have to choose to. We have to choose to step into it. We have to choose to be active in some way or another. Right?
And just to put that, one of the people who are in the 4 or 5 seat majority in the House, one represents most of Tucson, Juan Ciscomano, and he won by only 2,200 votes.
That's right.
And we can either work with him to save the budget or make sure that he doesn't come back.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Ron.
Okay, I
Does
don't
he
have an
have an
answer.
office? Does he have an office in Tucson?
Yes, he does, and I believe so. Because
Because I haven't been able to find any sign of an office for him in Tucson.
that would be bad if he did that. It would be bad for him.
What he might have done, because when you say Tucson, that's a little bit of a misnomer, Ron. It's It's more Marana and,
Yes,
yeah. So he's in the Tucson area, but not really much of Tucson.
but he does have a pretty large part, because I know they redrew the lines.
Right.
I know,
it's-
he's my representative, and I didn't vote for him.
It has the edges, but not the center of the county. If that makes sense. And so he may have, his office may be in Vail, his office may be in Marana or something. But you're right, that we should be. He's one of the people we need to be in conversation with. I remember, I did not like, Sally, what's her name? But we met with her twice. Once down in Benson and then once at her office here in Tucson. And we need to do that. We need to have those conversations.
Well, and he says that Jim Colby was one of his supporters. And Jim Colby worked with us very closely. Because our church, whenever we had letters signing, writing letters and stuff, and sent them to him, he always took our concerns to Congress.
Nice.
So I think we should use that, start doing that with Ciscomani and saying, well, Colby, who you said supports you, used to do this for us, and we are hoping you will too.
So let's begin working on those lines, Wendy. Let's try to figure out how to work with him. And try to draw,
And do it in a friendly way.
so to speak, right? He said, make him into the best possible representative he can be. At least part of the difficulty in all of politics right now is just the divisive nature, and it doesn't change unless people start crossing lines and moving towards. Who's going to do that?
Because I got a message from Move On, but I will get back to you because he's going to be in town next week.
Good.
So
Let me know.
I have your email, so when I find it out, I will
Okay.
keep you.
And just be sure you use the one that's Somaviki, not the one that's the Earthlink,
Okay.
the Gmail address.
Say again who it is that you're talking about.
Juan Ciscomani
Okay,
is one of our representatives in Congress.
yeah, okay. He's up in this area too, I think.
Yeah. The bad news is you guys haven't solved all the issues.
Yeah, right.
There's a bit still to go, isn't there?
It was a good
I would
discussion.
say so. It's getting worse right now instead of better.
Well, I go back and forth whether it's getting worse or better, Wendy. I don't know, but let's hope it's not getting worse. Let's try to work on it getting better.
Well, that's what we have to do because otherwise we're in deep doo-doo.
Well, I would say we're at a tipping point, so things are getting better and worse.
Maybe.
And it's just a matter of pushing it in the direction of bending the moral arc of the universe back towards justice.
That's right, moving in that direction and believing that it is going to do that. And it's tough. At least part of what I read in her writings is that Black Americans who had every reason to not believe in the system, not believe in the country, not believe in much of what we hold dear, still found things to believe in where they've carried us forward. I love that she frames this whole work in the fact that they are the biggest creators of true democracy here in America. That without the civil rights movement, without the Civil War and the freeing of slaves and the coming into power of those people who had been enslaved, that we wouldn't have the democracy that we have, that we didn't truly have democracy before that.
Well, and as she pointed out, once you had the rights of the slaves, that led to it gave the opening for LGBT rights and women's rights and so on and so forth.
That's right.
So that was the opening.
And so how do we?
Many of them realize it, and many of us do not.
Yeah, and so how do we continue to do that? That's our task. So over the next few weeks, we're gonna continue moving forward. We're gonna read chapter 3 for next week. If you don't have a book, I did put it on the chat.
So we're skipping chapter 2?
I'm sorry, chapter 2. It's the 3rd chapter, but one was the preview,
One was the preface.
the preface. So, did everyone, can everyone see that? Sorry, there's chapter 2 right now. I just put it on there. I hadn't pushed
Oh,
it.
there it is.
Okay, so if you just click on that, that's on the chat, you should be able to get chapter 2 if you don't have it.
Yeah, I already downloaded chapter 1, even though I have the book. I like to keep it in the.
Is it Daughters of Azimuth? Is that?
Yes, Dr. Azimuth is one of the first parts of it. That's exactly right. All right,
Thank you for the, thanks for
Thank
the
you.
discussion.
Susan, thank you for being here. Joyce, thank you. Good to see you.
Next week, then, the time is after the service for the Ash service.
Yeah, and I'm planning on it starting right at 7. We'll find out. I hope I can get the service done, but that's my plan to be done by 7.
Okay, so I guess we're all in person then.
Yeah, if you're here, come and be in person. You can see I got the room all set up. Next
Are
week-
you doing the service on the 25th for Pam Bassan's husband?
I am.
And you're also going to be at the church council?
I'm doing the service. I don't know what's happening with church council, but I'm gonna be at the service.
Oh,
And I
yeah,
will be at church council retreat when I can. Also, just so you know, we finished setting up that on the 11th, March the 11th, we have Patrika's service at 10 o'clock.